Good afternoon. Welcome to the Hines Interest presentation on their migration to the cloud. I'm pleased to introduce Michael Hernandez, their Director of IT Infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Don. As Don mentioned, my name is Mike Hernandez. I'm the IT Infrastructure Manager at Hines. I've been in the IT industry for about 25 years, the last 15 of which have been with Hines, and up until our cloud migration and through our cloud migration, I've been in charge of managing all of our IT infrastructure for Hines. If you're not familiar with Hines, we are a multinational commercial real estate company in, I believe, 25 countries with around 5,000 employees. A little further in the slide deck, we'll talk through some of the logistics. So today, what I wanted to talk about is how we moved our data center from an on-prem data center to cloud operations. And there's nothing that I'm going to say here today that is earth-shattering. There's nothing I'm going to say here today that is not logical. It's not an extension of the questions you should be asking yourselves, but it's an opportunity for me to speak about as somebody who's been through the process from the beginning stages of what if we go to the cloud to the end stages of we are now in the cloud and we have shut down our on-prem operations. What are the questions? What are the sort of hurdles that you run into? What are the risk factors? What are the challenges that you're going to run into? So with that said, I want to jump into a bit of a slide deck. I would encourage you, if you have any questions, please be sure to use the Q&A button located in the window in front of you so that you can ask those questions, and we'll get to those at the end of what I have prepared to say today. So jumping right in, the first question you should be asking yourself is, why would we want to move to the cloud? This is a business question. This should not be strictly a technology question. This should be about what the benefit is to the business. What are your risk factors? There has to, again, business benefits, IT benefits, those really do come secondary, but there are some real tangible IT benefits that you should consider. What are the platform benefits? Which cloud provider or cloud providers, plural, are you going to choose? Which one would you choose? Why? What are the scenarios in which you might choose one over another? And then there's some other considerations, something that we'll touch on a little bit more later in the presentation. If you're an international company, what are the ramifications of hosting that data center operation in a country outside of where those operations take place? So for example, if you have offices in Germany or you have a location in Germany, you have to be aware of what happens with the German data laws and the German privacy laws as to where you're going to host that information. So that leads you into your selection criteria. Which provider makes the most sense for you? And then the question you have to ask yourself is, are we going to handle this with our existing staff, or are we going to leverage a partner? And I've got here, the spoiler is yes, you absolutely want a partner. And we'll get into more of the reasons why, but this is a massive undertaking. Regardless of how big or experienced your staff is, you want someone who's done this before by your side. So a little bit about Hines and our landscape and what we were thinking about and why we made this decision. To put it bluntly, our business computing requirements were starting to outgrow the data center operations that we had. You have to consider that. You have to consider what your age of your hardware is. You have to consider where your locations are, where are your offices, what is their access to your data center infrastructure. If it's in one central location, does that still make sense, especially in a distributed working environment like we've had for the past 12 plus months? What does your network layout entail? What are your staffing needs? Do you have enough staff to support both an on-prem and cloud infrastructure if you decide to do a hybrid environment? Do you have enough staff that has the experience with a cloud environment? Your networking along that networking team, I've got networking twice for a reason. It's not just your network layout, but how you're going to integrate into your network these cloud operations. And then what are the type of server loads that you're going to load into the cloud? So some quick statistics at Hines. We are around 5,000 employees in 24 countries. Our data center operations were up until very recently hosted in a co-location facility in the United States. And when we started this project, we had about 130 servers to migrate, around 85 terabytes of data, which entails 27 business applications. And we run a very lean shop at Hines as far as our IT staff, especially when you compare that to the number of employees that we have. Just to be candid about it, we have 4 on-staff server admins, 1 on-staff senior network engineer with some contract help behind her, and we all do a great job, but that's a very lean staff given the demands that the businesses continue to put onto us. So, as I mentioned before, this is a business assessment. This should not be an IT assessment. This should not be just a technical assessment. You have to understand what the business needs are to be successful with this. So what I've done is I've kind of sat down and said, what were the questions we asked? And then on the next slide, I'll say, what were the answers that we came to or that you should come to as you're going through this thought process? So the first thing is, how often do you refresh your data center hardware? For us at Hines, we were looking at about an 8 to 10 year cycle on our server hardware, which again, this is leads back into why we were being outpaced by the business requirements. How often are you refreshing your data center operating systems? Is the cloud migration an opportunity to homogenize your data center, your operating systems, excuse me. Do you currently have a bill back model? So this is something that's a little bit more interesting when you start to talk about cloud operations, because they get very granular about usage, down to, in a lot of cases, hourly usage of CPU and RAM. So when you start to consider that, you start to think about, what is my cost per application? What is my cost per application from a production standpoint, from a business continuity standpoint, and from a disaster recovery standpoint? So you are able to start to factor in, am I going to be able to bill back to the business? Do I want to bill back to the business, or is this all going to be a capital expense? And then if you decide to bill back, are you going to bill back by server? Are you going to bill back by terabytes of storage? Or are you going to bill back by application? So it's some things to consider as you're going down this path. How much are you spending on backup and disaster recovery? And do you know, again, how much per application? So you can get pretty granular with this. And then again, this is a big one, but if you're an international company or you have any sort of privacy law considerations, you really need to take a long look at which providers you are considering, and have you considered what it's going to take from a legal standpoint if you have to move some of those workloads into a country-specific workload operation. So after the assessment should come the outcome. So you need to determine for your company if you should adopt an infrastructure as a service, software as a service, or a combination of both. This is a potential change to your cost model from going to operational costs to bill back operations, and then your disaster recovery sauce. And then you need to have a big discussion around privacy laws. I cannot stress that enough, especially in a company as international as Hines. We had to have a lot of discussions along the way about how this was going to work. So let's talk about your IT personnel. What are your IT infrastructure resources doing? Obviously, as the IT infrastructure manager, this is near and dear to my heart, but what are your resources currently doing? And this comes into, I know that there have been some cases, and let's just get this out in the open, the cost models. The cost models for moving to a cloud operation are very, very different than from an on-prem operation. Typically with an on-prem operation, you're going to buy hardware, use it for a period of time. That's a depreciating cost. That's a sunk cost. Whereas with the data set, with a cloud operation, you're going to have monthly costs, recurring costs. So that's a different mindset and a different model, but you can use that to your advantage. Here's why. If your infrastructure team is spending time doing things like patching, firmware updates, they're managing storage, so-and-so says, I need an extra terabyte for my new database, that's just time spent. And in some cases, that's upfront dollars spent saying, I need to allocate some dollars towards buying another tray of disks, or I need to make sure that we have space in our disaster recovery to expand and hold for that new terabyte of storage. What do your backups look like? What are you spending on your backups? Is the time that you're spending on your backups? Did they run last night? How many people do you have right now who are spending time and effort making sure the backups ran last night, when a lot of these cloud providers have already got this figured out for you? It's just rolled into part of the package deal. What are you spending on? What kind of time are you spending on device failures? How many of us have ever had a hard drive that went south in a SAN that we had to stop everything, or somebody on your team has to stop everything, call the provider, get the drive out there? If it's at a co-location facility, have somebody go on site, put the drive in, make sure it spins up, all those things. And then the cost and time cost of maintaining your disaster recovery infrastructure. This is a very real thing for a lot of companies, that if you pick the right provider and the right partner, they can help you manage some of these and take that off of your current employee workload. So the outcome is you don't necessarily let go of any employees, because that's a big concern that those of us who are the geeks, if you will, on this side of the fence, well, they're gonna make me lose my job. They're gonna automate everything. They're gonna automate the backups, and I'm gonna be out of a job. It's not about getting rid of your resources. It's about reallocating your resources. Let them become systems integrators. Let them talk about the processes rather than the operational side of things. Your personnel can become the people who either they escalate to the provider, they escalate to your partner, and then they manage that relationship with your partner. In a lot of cases, in the clouds, in the operations we're going to today, a lot of cases, people don't want to continue to spend time doing backups, maintaining replication, making sure things worked last night. That's time that somebody else from a cloud provider perspective has already figured out. Next, let's talk about the actual technical assessment. And again, this is all, there's nothing earth-shattering here. There's nothing here that I'm telling anyone that isn't a logical thought process. This is just how we did it, and this is how we were successful doing so. So first thing you have to decide is, what workloads are going to move? Are you going to go all in and move all of your production and development and disaster recovery? Are you going to say, hey, let's just move disaster recovery to a cloud provider? Are you going to say, let's just move development to a cloud provider because that's where we need the most flexibility of space and resources? Whatever works for you makes a lot of sense, and work with your partner, work with your provider to make sure that your needs are being met and that you are making the most efficient use of your investment. To that end, what provider makes the most sense for your business needs? What applications are you hosting? Does your provider have experience with those applications? Does your partner have experience with those applications? And at a fundamental level, does the cloud provider even support the operating system that your hardware needs? In some cases, if you have heavy appliances, those might not be able to move to certain cloud providers. How many applications are you going to move? How many servers? Again, because if you're starting to talk about applications, the applications run across multiple servers. How many servers do you need to move? What is your current security posture? Do you have any specific needs that either preclude you from moving to the cloud or would be enhanced by you moving to a cloud provider? For example, one of the things that we ran into was we had some old firewalls that we said, you know what, these are old firewalls. Rather than make the investment in putting in new firewalls and setting all that up, let's use the cloud migration as an opportunity to enhance our security posture. And then the last technical question that you need to ask yourself, at least at a high level, is how are you going to integrate your new cloud infrastructure into your environment? Is it going to be just another subnet in your network? Are you going to take the opportunity to say, let's move all of these to a new workspace? Are we going to say, let's go VDI? I mean, you can really think outside the box on some of this, as long as your cloud provider and your partner help you through that process. And so as you have the assessment, you have the outcome. You make your decision about what workloads are going to move. You make your decision about what provider or providers you want to use for hosting. You have your application list finalized. You have your server list finalized. You have your security options available to you through your provider so that you know what they can or cannot provide. And you have your integration plan. And this is where you take a break, you take a look at this, you work with your provider and your partner, and you say, let's generate a statement of work based around exactly what we need so that there are no surprises in the billing, there are no surprises with scope creep, there are no surprises along the way, because this is a very complex project with a lot of moving pieces. And then some other things that fall sort of in the miscellaneous category outside of all the technical considerations. I mentioned this before, but this migration is an opportunity. When I mentioned earlier, we had 130 servers that we decided we needed to move to the cloud. As we were migrating, we started to realize, and here's a fun story that as a server admin, I can tell you that some of you have probably run into. When we had our master server list built, we went to the application owners and said, right, here are all the servers that we show assigned to you. And in multiple cases, I went to those application owners and said, right, here are your server lists. And they said, well, this server's not mine. And I would go back to them and say, well, it most certainly is yours. I provided it for you to do this. Oh, well, we never ended up using it. So it's funny and it's fun when it's on-prem, because really all you're doing is you're spending resources out of the money that you've already spent on your IT infrastructure. But the downside of that is, in the cloud environment, as I mentioned before, if you're paying per CPU per hour or per CPU per day or per month or whatever that period is, that's money wasted. So this is a great opportunity for you to make sure that every server you have is being used and is being used to your fullest potential, to its fullest potential. In some cases, we went to the application owners and said, here's your server list, here are the list of applications, and they said, oh, great, we've been looking for an opportunity to retire that application. We've been looking for an opportunity to move off of that application onto this better, newer, greater, maybe it's a SaaS application now instead of an on-prem application. So there were some workloads that we were able to just say, great, that's not making the transition across, that application's being retired. And so to go back to something I mentioned a few minutes ago, at the onset, we had 130 servers that needed to move across. By the time we were finished, that number was closer to 80. So there was a lot of extra space being used, and it wasn't that we were being wasteful about it. We were just being smart as we made the transition across to, let's upsize some of these servers and right-size them for the application. And then in some case it was, hey, this whole set of infrastructure doesn't need to move across because that application is not going to make the journey to the cloud. What tools does the provider offer that you don't have today? What sort of tools do they have from a security standpoint? Do they have faster disk? Maybe you don't have SSD in your data center today, and maybe your new provider does. Do they have some options where you could pay a little bit more and say, we want this to be on ultra fast disk, we want this to have a lot more CPU? It's much more scalable because they've already made the investment in the hardware. They don't have that lead time on procuring new hardware, procuring new disks. Conversely, the other thing you have to think about is, what are you doing today that you will not be able to do in your cloud provider? Concrete example there, if you're doing some fancy load balancing, and I won't name vendor names or any of that sort of stuff, but if you're doing fancy load balancing, there may be some things that the load balancers in your cloud provider can or cannot do or can't do in the same way. So you have to set your expectations, and you have to work with your partner to make sure that you're making the most use of what your provider has to offer. One of the things that I mentioned before is that we looked at our operating systems across all of our servers, and we said this is an opportunity to get rid of some of our older operating systems. Again, maybe it's an application that's being retired, maybe it's a server farm that we don't need anymore, or maybe it's just, hey, we don't think this application will run on anything newer than Server 2008 R2, but we've never tried it. So this is your opportunity to try that. And it's an opportunity for you to draw a line in the sand and say, from now on, we will no longer support an operating system older than this. Whether that's a Linux-based operating system or a Windows-based operating system, you have an opportunity in front of you to be able to say, this is the line that we're not going to go any farther back than this. And if it can't be supported by your cloud provider, it doesn't make the transition. And then you have to evaluate what you do with those applications. Do you leave them on-prem, or do you decide that application can be retired or replaced? And lastly, if you aren't very disciplined on your current naming convention, this is an opportunity for you to get your naming convention in check. What I mean by that is, are all of your servers named in such a way that you know instantly, or your admins know instantly, I'm having a problem with this application, it's these 3 servers, because I can tell instantly that those are the server names associated with that application. So one of the things that I realized at an alarmingly fast rate is that you will learn more about your environment than you likely ever wanted to know. All the gremlins in the system, all the things that never worked quite right, all the people who said, I've been running low on disk space for the last 6 months and didn't bother to tell anyone, you will find all of those things out. So if nothing else, this is an opportunity for you to do a full audit of your data center operations. And so I said it before, but do you want to go in-house, use your existing resources? Do you want your IT infrastructure team to become experts supporting the cloud platform you've chosen? This is a big question, because whether you choose Azure or Oracle Cloud or AWS or any of the other major players or any of the smaller players, do you want your team to become experts in that cloud platform? Maybe you do. Maybe this is part of your retooling process. Maybe this is part of your resource reallocation process where you say, Jim, you've been with us for 15 years. You're our best Windows admin. I'm going to have you become an expert in Oracle. I'm going to have you become an expert in Azure. And you give them the opportunity to say, great, I'm learning a new skill set. In an ever-changing work environment, especially with the last 12 plus months of pandemic and people being reassigned and losing their jobs, this is an opportunity for people to retool their skill sets. What are the relative, both real and opportunity costs of training your staff? Do you want Jim to become an expert in Azure or Oracle Cloud? And if so, are you willing to send him to the training necessary to properly support your environment? If not, a partner probably makes a lot more sense because they bring that expertise to the table already. They will bring with you we've done this for other customers. In so many cases, and like I said at the onset of this, I've been at Hines for 15 years now. In so many cases, I don't want to know what has been successful at other companies. I want to know what has not been successful at other companies, because that is where I learn the most from our partners have come and said, we tried it that way a couple times, and here's what you haven't thought about. Here's why that might fail for you. And then the last question you have to ask yourself is, does your staff want to gain this expertise? Are they interested in learning a new platform? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. If they're not, if they're already spread thin, like I mentioned before, at Hines we run a really lean shop. Maybe they don't have the bandwidth, or they say, hey, I've got a full plate already. I can't learn this to the degree necessary to become an expert in it. That's where you start to look for your partners, because partners will bring that in, and partners really become an extension of your team. Our partnership with Denovo, when we have an issue, I gave up my access to all my consoles of my server, but what I gained in that is the knowledge that I can put in a ticket and someone will take care of the issue. And that really cannot be understated as helping me sleep at night, helping me know that my systems are being cared for 24/7, 365, and it's no longer just my team that's responsible for it. Pick a good partner with them, and listen to their advice because they've done this before. So then you get into the nuts and bolts of how are we going to migrate. You've decided for all the right reasons why this project makes sense, why this process makes sense. So how are we going to do it? Are we going to run in parallel, or are we going to forklift? What we did with Denovo at Hines, and to be candid, we moved to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure. And the reason we moved to Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, let me go back and touch on that because I did neglect to mention that earlier. In our application list, the biggest application in my data center was JD Edwards. So it made a lot of sense for us to say, what is a supportable platform now? What will be a supportable platform for years to come? If my biggest tenant is JD Edwards, then it made a lot of sense for us to move to Oracle Cloud. And from a partnership perspective, we looked to Denovo for not just being experts in Oracle Cloud, but also in JD Edwards. Here's why. If you have a problem and you have a separate JD Edwards administrative staff from your hardware staff, you might end up in a situation where you have finger pointing. We, the administrators, think that there's a hardware issue. We think there's a performance issue. Well, we on the infrastructure side can tell you empirically, CPU looks great, RAM utilization looks great, disk IOPS look great, disk Q-Link looks great. It's not a hardware issue. It's not an operating system issue. The problem with that is that you as the customer are stuck in the middle of that, and that is not a place you want to be. Again, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but this is the kind of thought process that you have to consider. If you have, you'll pardon the colloquialism, but if you have one throat to choke, then if your admins have direct access to your hardware, such as it is with a cloud provider, then that gives you the peace of mind that they will detect the problem, diagnose the problem, fix the problem without having to get on the phone with multiple vendors. It makes a lot of sense, and it made a lot of sense for us. So are you going to do parallel, or are you going to forklift? This really comes down to how much downtime do you want. What we did at Hines was we took the opportunity to change our naming convention a little bit on our servers. get more specific about the server names and how they relate to their applications. And then we worked with Denovo to build out a parallel infrastructure that we had access to, that our users had access to, but we would take an application by application approach and say, right, it's time to move application X. So we replicate that information, or we copy that information, or reinstall the software on the other servers. And at some point, it really comes down to just a simple DNS change. So all that your users notice is that when I logged in this morning, I had a new version of the software. That's a really cool feeling to be able to do that. And from an outage perspective, if you have a parallel environment, you have more time to test, you have a cleaner cutover, and you have the ability to say, okay, if we had a problem, we can roll back. The downside to a parallel, of course, is you're paying for those resources the moment they are spun up. So keep that in mind, that there are some pros and cons to the approaches. As I mentioned, it probably makes the most sense to move application by application rather than server by server, because servers, as I call them, they work in families. These 3 or 4 servers make up this family of this application. These 5 or 6 servers make up this family for JD Edwards. This 20, 30 servers make up this family for JD Edwards for us. So if you focus on it by application, suddenly that insurmountable project becomes much more attainable. You can take it in smaller steps. Think about your licensing ramifications. We're a Microsoft shop for a lot of our stuff. So you have to talk to depending on whether you have an enterprise agreement or some sort of other agreement with Microsoft or Oracle or whoever your software providers are, talk to them about, we're moving to the cloud. What does that mean? In some cases, they will charge you per CPU per hour. In some cases, they may say there's a flat fee, but know what those are up front and make that part of your decision. Because if you don't, you're going to end up with costs that you weren't originally expecting. And that's a bad spot to be in. I will say candidly that there were no scenarios that we could run through where we said it's going to be cheaper for us to go to the cloud. It just wasn't. It was going to be cheaper for us to stay on-prem. But all of the expertise, all of the flexibility, and all of the resource workloads from a personnel perspective that we offloaded made that a very easy decision for us at Hines. The next thing to consider is your time frame. And time frame and parallel and forklift are very closely related, because is there some sort of a deadline? For example, do I have a piece of hardware where I'm going to have to renew maintenance on it in 6 months? So maybe I need to have this project done before that big bill hits. Maybe that helps you understand which workloads you can move faster. So it's a multi-dimensional array, to use a programming term. It's a multi-dimensional array, and you just have to pick what the criteria are that make the most sense for you to make the moves. And then arrange for your application owners and your business users to test. I cannot stress enough how important testing is. Again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but make your application owners have a stake in the project. Make your business users have a stake in the project. Don't talk to them about cost, especially the business users. They don't care. That's a sunk cost to the business. But tell them why this will benefit them. In a lot of cases, it's things like you won't have to VPN in anymore. And as simple as we make VPN in for our users these days, that's still a huge selling point, surprisingly huge selling point. So as you're migrating and after you've migrated, what are the next steps? Because this is not a start and finish and we're done and we can just wipe our brow and say, okay, that was great, everybody, great job, we're done, we don't have to think about this ever again. There are some things that you need to consider. As I mentioned earlier, if you're being charged per hour, per week, per month, per terabyte, you need to think about how your new server requests come in. At Hines, it used to be just put in a ticket and one of my teams will spin up a new VM. Just let us know what the specs are, and if the specs aren't insane, we'll spin you up a new VM in a day or so. In a cloud operation, you have to think about things like how much storage is it going to consume and what's the price of that? How many CPUs is it going to have? How does that impact licensing? What are the disaster recovery requirements for this? Is it something that has to have a higher tier of disaster recovery, or are backups to a remote location sufficient? All of those. Oh, and one other thing to consider are egress costs. Is this an application that's going to have a lot of data egress? That's something you have to consider when you move to a cloud provider, because Whereas in a co-location facility, in a privately held on-prem facility, you pay for, let's say, a gigabit circuit. You can use a gigabit, you can use as much bandwidth as you want. It's just your hardware. When you start to go to a cloud provider, you have to consider what that's going to do to your egress costs. And after you make all of those determinations, what were you doing before to request new servers? What are you going to do afterwards? And what were you doing before? Does it still make sense? Maybe you don't have to change your process. Maybe you had a clean change management process where you could say every new server has a change request associated with it. While you are going through your migration, continue to do security assessments. Hold your provider accountable, hold your partner accountable for, are you giving us the most secure posture possible? Because again, this migration is an opportunity for you to make sure that you are getting the most out of your investment. And another consideration, as I mentioned earlier, are usage reports. Some of these costs are now hourly, so you need to make the most of your investment. And I keep saying that, but this is an investment. And you need to be able to look at a glance, work with your partner, work with your provider, look at a glance and say, which of these servers are oversubscribed? Which of these servers are undersubscribed? Are there opportunities to consolidate workloads onto maybe two application servers instead of 5 application servers? If you're being billed by number of servers, by storage consumed, by CPU, by hour, you need to consider what you can do to consolidate. So that is the end of my prepared set of questions, or my prepared statements. Do we have any questions in the Q&A?
All right, we'll give everybody a couple of minutes. Hey, Michael, one did come in. You talked about the importance of, from a business standpoint, of having it's really a business decision. What were the top 2 or 3 factors that, as you went through your decision process, that resulted in the choice you made? I know you referenced the Oracle Katie Edwards side, but any other items that were key factors?
Sure. I think one of the big ones is compliance. It's a lot easier to go to a cloud provider and say, provide me your SOC 1 reports, provide me your reports of your posture scanning, provide me where you have had your various reports run, your audits run, and where you pass those, so that now that instead of that being put on your infrastructure team to go and say, this is what our firewall looks like, here are the logs from the firewall, here are all the people who have physical access to the data center. Those types of questions either go away or you can give those to your provider now, and that's a huge offload. But from a business perspective, the knowledge that we are in one of the major providers, that we are in an Oracle that have figured this out, and it's not just the Hines team, what I like to call the Swiss Army nerds who know a little bit about everything, who are trying to make things work. You've got real liability and culpability standing behind the provider at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
One other one here for you. Now that you have closed down your data center and you've completed this process, you've gained all this experience, what would you have done different?
Well, I think the easiest question there is, we wouldn't have tried to do this in the middle of a pandemic. And that's a little bit of a flippant answer, but we had to have a real hard discussion around middle of March last year about whether we wanted to move forward with this project, because we were in this pandemic, everyone's suddenly working from home, working remotely, and everything was working. The users were coming back and saying, hey, I can really work remotely. This is working for me. Did it make sense for us to continue to move forward? Ultimately, the reasons we did were because we still had aging hardware, and it wasn't going to get any younger. We still had situations where hard drives were failing. We were still replacing things on a pretty regular basis. And then add to that, what if your co-location facility says, hey, due to the pandemic, we can't let on-site vendors anymore to come in and change out your hard drives. Now what do? You have some real concerns there. The other thing I think I would do is probably try to be more diligent about accelerating the timeline. This project dragged out frankly, because I'm risk averse, and as the project manager, I wanted to take it very slowly and very methodically. We were very successful because we did that, but there were times where after executing portions of the project, I realized that was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. So we could have moved a little bit faster.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't think we have any other questions. So I will say to all the attendees, Michael did a very nice video of their data center shutdown and the history and all those items. I believe he's going to post that in the chat so that you guys can take a look at it at your leisure. But again, want to thank everyone for attending unless there's any more questions.
Yep, absolutely. I would like to thank both you, Don, and Mike, for being on the presentation today. You both did a great job. And I would welcome everybody on the line to join us in the Denovo booth today at 4 o'clock for top 10 tips and tricks with JDE. And then also join Denovo on the main stage again tomorrow for our third and final session here at Envision in Focus. And for tomorrow, we'll be speaking about how to stay current on JD AdWords with application lifecycle management. So feel free to join us in the booth this evening, or feel free to join us on the main stage tomorrow morning. We appreciate it.
Excellent. And I did see that one other question came in. The copies of the slides, I did upload those to the files associated with this session. So I believe you should be able to get to them. And if not, I think Don or Megan should be able to get you those as well. I'll be able to speak here in just a moment.
Absolutely.
Make sure.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
Thank you all, and I appreciate your time today. Have a great rest of your conference.